under the Articles of Confederation. What was this thing? Well, it was the Spanish milled dollar. You have to remember there was a great deal of trade that went on between the West Indies and the American colonies. And the primary coin in the West Indies and Central America, South America, the silver coin, at least primary silver coin, was the Spanish piece of 8. And it was called a piece of 8 because the actual Spanish unit of coinage was the real. And there were 8 reals worth of silver in this particular coin, so they called it a piece of 8. It had eight units in it. That was also called the Spanish milled dollar. Dollar coming actually from the German word Thaler, because some of these coins were the original form developed in Austria, but you have to remember the Austrian Empire and the Spanish Empire often had the same ruling family, so there's a connection there. But in any event,
right. So we're talking history here. Yeah, this is early American colonies for using these coins from Spain
as their unit. As their unit. So Thomas Jefferson, who was actually the man who proposed this to Congress, he said, look, if we're going to come up with our own monetary system, we don't want to invent it out of nothing. We want to use what's actually out there in the marketplace and not derange the system by trying to impose something that's absolutely new. So he proposed to the Continental Congress the use of the Spanish mill dollar as the American unit. And then that was picked up, of course, in the Constitution, because that dollar reference is referring to something that's already existing. That's the Spanish mill dollar. Mm-hmm. And then Hamilton and Jefferson, when they were both in Washington's cabinet, they agreed that the way to determine what this word meant in a practical sense was to go out into the marketplace and do what we would call a statistical analysis of what kind of dollars were circulating. Because you have to remember, dollars, they came out of the Spanish mints, they tried to maintain a fixed amount of silver, but there was a certain amount of slippage in the technology of the time, and then these dollars were circulating by hand through many different hands, and of course a certain amount of the silver would wear off. So the question was, what was the marketplace accepting at the time as a essentially standard Spanish mill dollar? Some would be a little heavier, some would be a little lighter, but people would pass them from hand to hand, even though they might have a certain amount of abrasion. And
okay, so this is Washington. You know, the Constitution is written. Washington becomes the first president, and then Hamilton and Jefferson in the cabinet are determining they need to do a little bit of definition as to what exactly the Constitution.
And so they did it. So they did it. And the first Coinage Act, so-called Mint Act of 1792, makes a statement. It says the dollar or unit shall be of the value of the Spanish mill dollar is the same as now current. And what that meant was how much silver did the Spanish mill dollar, typical Spanish mill dollar, in the American economy at that time contain. And they determined that, 371.25 grains of silver. That then becomes a finding of historical fact, as lawyers would say. It's the finding of what that word dollar in the Constitution meant at that point in time.
Okay,
because they actually went out and found out what it meant.
Okay, so they wrote this as part of historical record of the executive branch. How did they publish?
Well, it's the legislative branch, Mint Act of 1792.
Okay, sorry, right. Okay,
so
that declared
the statute makes the finding.
Right, gotcha.
Well, it's not. Here's the difference. It's not so much a declaration. It's not as if they came out and said, "Well, we've decided that a dollar should contain 400 grains of silver." What they did was we went into the marketplace and determined what a dollar does contain.
Right.
Big difference.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you talk about the power to declare something, well, it can be anything you want. But if you talk about the power to find an historical fact, once you have determined what that historical fact is, that's fixed. You can't change a determination of history. We can't go back now and say, well, Hamilton and Jefferson and the people who did that chemical analysis were wrong, because we don't have their samples.
Right.
There's no way for us to correct that.
Sounds more like the thing we'd prefer Congress to do. How about just telling us what the marketplace says rather than the other way around, trying to...
Well, that's what the Constitution did, essentially.
Uh-huh.
It told the government that it had to adopt as its unit permanently what the marketplace had already adopted.
Okay. So this Coinage Act was a step in accomplishing that.
Right. So what we started with in this system was a fixed commodity unit, a certain weight of silver. The dollar is a essentially a measure of weight. In the same way that an acre is a measure of land, a bushel is a measure of volume, a dollar is a measure of silver in a particular coin. Peculiar way of doing it, but that was the historical way. You know, these coins of different countries had certain names, and those names related, at least initially, to a particular weight of gold or silver. So we had a silver-based system. Gold comes into the system through the market exchange rate. If the market exchange rate between silver and gold is, say, 15 to 1, then a dollar's weight of gold, 371 1/4 grains of gold, would be worth $15. Pretty simple, huh? But it's all tied to the marketplace. So you have a commodity-based system where the market is determining ultimately the values of the money. And the sole purpose of the government, having adopted this, is to maintain the coinage system consistent with the system of weights and measures the Constitution has adopted.
Right, so continue to go out in that marketplace, provide a central source for trusted research on what the marketplace is telling us.
That's right. So the dollar never changes its weight. That's 371 1/4 grains because that's a historical fact that was determined, gone, done. The gold coinage may change its value from time to time because the exchange rate between gold and silver in the market is not fixed. Mm-hmm. It fluctuates. And the only thing the government is supposed to do, if it coins coins, is to do it honestly. If they say this coin has a dollar's worth of silver, it has to have 371 1/4 grains of silver. If they say the coin has an ounce of gold, it bloody well better have an ounce of gold. That was the constitutional structure that was initially set up. Now, it didn't preclude private parties from making their own legitimate coinage. It didn't preclude people from having banks that we would understand today in terms of generating bank notes, provided all that was done non-fraudulently and they were held accountable for their debts. But it separated the government from all of those private activities, what I call separation of bank and state. Mm-hmm. Banks were not going to be specially privileged by the government, and the government was not going to have some specially privileged position with those banks in terms of their operations. And for all of us, we would have a sound currency basis that had a direct connection and ultimately a direct control by the market, because the principle in the coinage system that the Constitution gives us is what the framers used to call free coinage. Now, nothing's free in life, but what this meant was that people could come to the mint with their gold and silver bullion, and the mint would coin this essentially at cost. All right? There'd be no extra charge. It wasn't going to make a profit from it. What this then resulted in was the market's control over the amount of money that was generated. Because if people brought gold and silver to the mints, it would be minted into coin. If they didn't bring it, it wouldn't be minted into coin. And how much gold and silver would be mined initially would depend upon the alternative use of resources, labor and capital. It could go into other areas. So the market was always going to be controlling the amount of gold and silver that would come to the mint and become money. So the money supply was actually market directed. It was not politically directed. Mm-hmm. That's the correct system. Now, what turned out to have happened was that bankers, of course, who are in the business of expanding credit and expanding money, that's how they make their profits. Sure. They want to keep expanding and earn interest on this money. Their tactic was to generate paper money or later just plain bank credits, which